Good day, podcasters. My name is Amy J. from the US, and welcome to PodcasterHQ News. And with me
is Ant McGinley in the UK, where a few weeks ago I got a seemingly official and very innocent email, I thought, from Google Podcasts, which said, Google Podcast Manager, re-verify show ownership to get new listener data in Podcast Manager for this very show. So I thought, well, that's fine. And I read it. It says, Google systems have chosen a different RSS feed to serve your show on Google podcasting services. Google believes that this new feed better represents your show. Because your show has not previously verified this new feed, the current show will not include any new listeners. Blah, blah, blah. So I thought, okay, that seems a little bit odd, but it looks official. It looks from Google. Fine, no problem. So I verified it, sent it away. That was that. And then about a week ago, I got almost exactly the same email again, which made me suspicious. And then this story popped up from a chap called Jason Kalkanis, you might have seen on Twitter. He does the podcast All In. And it seems that one of his episodes had ads in it, which he hadn't put there. And it seems that what had happened was Google had switched his podcast in his app to point towards a pirated copy with an ad. What? How does this happen? Now, if you're thinking, I've not heard of his podcast, well, it's not huge. It's not like Joe Rogan, but you may have heard last year, this was a bit of an incident where big podcasts were being pirated. Literally, somebody was taking the whole audio and then putting it on a separate feed and claiming the advertising revenue for it. Now, there are ways to shut this down, but it seems a bit odd that somebody would be pirating a relatively small podcast like ours, for example. Why would somebody want to do this, Amy?
it's a mystery. It's also, right, you would think that it's a good thing, right? Imitation is a highest form of flattery and all that. No, guys, no, it's not. Because while they are imitating you and stealing your hard-earned work, it's not coming to you. You're not you're not having the analytics recognized. People don't know. And what does this mean for potential partners, sponsorships, ads, and the like?
Yeah, this is, I'm not even sure imitation is the right word. This is downright
stealing,
ripping off everything that you've done and claiming it as theirs. Now, this happened to a friend of ours, somebody whose podcast that we've plugged previously on the show, Caroline Verdon's At Least You Didn't. And it was actually an episode that I'd appeared on, and that podcast appeared on Anchor. And one of the benefits of places like Anchor is you can pop up a podcast for free, but people have been using this to put podcasts on, but not producing their own podcast, because as we all know, it takes a lot of work to put a podcast together. It takes many hours to put in to do that. But there seems to be, and we're not exactly sure how it's happening or who's behind it, but more and more people are actually taking pre-existing podcasts, putting it out on separate feeds, and then claiming the listenership, the audience, and with it the audience and the revenue that comes from advertising. Now, individually, this may not take a great deal. Like, for example, if they take our show right now, they're not going to make a huge heap of bucks. But if you're doing this with some kind of automated process, which is picking up multiple podcasts, you could be making a tidy sum. So the thing is to check, to stop this happening to you. First of all, make sure that your podcast is going from the right RSS feed, and also ask your listenership as well. So if you don't put adverts into your podcast and people are reporting that there are adverts in there, that is a pretty good sign that something is going on. Now, James Cridland over at podnews.net, they've developed this handy little tool which will check your RSS feed on places like Google Podcasts. But just be aware that this is happening. And as Amy says, don't necessarily be flattered if you hear this, because you could be losing out to quite a significant amount.
It's quite a scary thing, right? I mean, to know that your audience is looking for you and someone else is taking them away.
Yeah. And what's happened in this case that I mentioned there with Jason is that Google actually automatically switched his podcast, it seems to be, to a copy they found which they thought was better on Spreaker. But that copy was a pirated copy of his podcast. Now, if your podcast has been pirated, you can report it. It can be a little bit of a pain in the butt to do all this. There's a lot of forms to fill in. There is a thing called the DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Agreement, which will help them take it down. Unfortunately, it's not the smoothest process so far, but you'd also want to report it directly to your podcast directories as well. So Apple, Google, Spotify, places like Podchaser as well. And most importantly, your podcast host.
And I think that's the key, guys, that Ant just said. This is podcast directory specific, right? So it may be happening on Google right now, but please check your Spotify, check your Ghana, check your everywhere you have your podcast hosted. You should be checking periodically to make sure it's the right feed that's being used, the one from your host and not someone else.
Yeah, this almost feels like this would make a good podcasting job, having somebody to check this kind of thing. And speaking of podcasting jobs, here's Amy with a story on that.
Yeah, guys, years ago, you wouldn't think podcasting could be a job. People were doing it for hobbies. People are doing it for their business. But now we are finding that podcast jobs are on the rise. It is something that is growing. It is an observation Ant and I have had over the past few months, actually, in which case podcast job postings are rising. And Ant, we're finding it not just in podcast specific places, company websites where people are posting it, but in Google, in LinkedIn, in Indeed, and even Pod News, which we mentioned before. They have a new dedicated section just to podcasting jobs. And it's an amazing thing, guys, because you may think all I can do is create a podcast. Well, use your talents. Think outside the box. You could be the podcast editor for a company, a podcast host they're hiring. Our friend Phil Lanos, he does podcast hosting for a company. Yeah. So their jobs are on the rise, and so we wanted to share that information with you.
Yeah, and the thing is, what you'll notice, even if you just peruse through LinkedIn and type the word podcast into jobs, you'll get so many more hits than you were getting previously. The word podcast has been included in many other job descriptions, and you've got specific job titles. Plus, as well, what we've seen in the last 18 months, companies like Netflix have hired a head of podcasts for them to move into that market. And all the big media companies over the last few years have added these. And of course, when you add a head, you also add everybody that works underneath them and that department. And so for those of you that are working at this as something of a hobby and really enjoying it, there's a lot of opportunity, in fact, more opportunity than ever before. And that can be both in a freelance capacity to work for multiple projects like I do across a wild array, or to go and work dedicated for somebody else. Now, the one thing to be aware of, if you move into a dedicated role, is you may experience something in terms of a conflict of interest, in which they may ask you to put what you're doing independently to one side while you're working for them. And also, just to be aware that just look at your contract closely if you take one of these, because they may claim some ownership to your side podcasts that you're doing as well. But the opportunities out there are great, and the training and the experiences and connections that you could get through working for one of these companies can really open some doors for you.
So take a look, guys. Be mindful of the search you're doing. Connect, have conversations, right? Those are the most important things. If you don't know where to start, please check the show description. We're going to share a few links to help get you started in finding it, but don't let that limit you. If you're looking for a job in podcasting, the ocean is full of fish.
Yeah, and either side of the ocean, there's a lot of jobs.
Well, guys, if you've enjoyed this conversation and our past episodes, Ant and I also have a private feed where we talk about podcasting and frequently asked questions that you may not hear or get answers to elsewhere, which you can find on our website at podcasterhq.net/101. The link is in the little ticker at the bottom.
Yeah, and in the show notes as well. And I, for one, am very pleased that we managed to make a whole show without mentioning Spotify. Until next time, keep podcasting.
Take care.